Persepolis. This is considered one of the top 10 comic books of all time, is on everyone's must-read list, and it's also been considered required reading in multiple schools. Do I think this is one of the best comic books ever written? And do I think that this controversial story is one that you should be reading too? Hello everyone, and welcome back to Married with Comics. I'm your host, Laura. Now we are getting closer and closer to that 500 subscriber giveaway. Thank you all so much for your continued participation, likes, comments, subscriptions. You all are helping us grow, and we really appreciate it. We have many great giveaways coming to you very soon. Persepolis. This is a book written by Marjane Satrapi. She is a woman who grew up in Iran, lived in Austria for many years, and wrote a biographical story. So she actually did the artwork and the writing on this book. And we have two different volumes that are available. This is the first one, so this is a story of a childhood, which is more of her life in Iran. And then the second volume is her life in Austria as a teenager into adulthood. So this story starts in 1980, and then it continues through the revolution and the war that was declared by Iran upon Iraq. Now, the story itself, it is actually a very simple story. The chapters are maybe 4 to 6 pages long, so it's a very quick read. And honestly, when you start it, because the storyline is simple, the main character is Marjane, and she's just an adorable little girl that you immediately kind of start rooting for. But because everything is so simple, and you're seeing everything from this child's perspective, it's easy to take this story for granted just a little bit. It's a very quick read. And the more you start getting into the pages, the more you start seeing this revolution unfold. And you start to see the different perspectives. You see this revolution, but you see it from a child's eyes. So there are moments where she understands what's going on. And there are times where some things are going on that she doesn't quite understand what it means when she's playing the revolutionary on the playground. And I think that that's a lot of the brilliance of this story, is that as we go along and as this character gets older and as we go through the book, the concepts and what's going on in this revolution get more real. We have lives that are taken. We have bombs that are dropping. There are so many other big cataclysmic events that, of course, take place. And you see how, as a small child, she doesn't understand that when you talk about revolutions, that it involves all these things, and it can mean the lives of your loved ones. So as she gets older, she starts to understand the events that are taking place around her. Not only is she appreciating it, but we're also seeing the realism behind it. Now, this story has been recommended and required reading in a lot of high schools. Because of the simplistic nature of the story, I can definitely understand why you would recommend a young adult read this. However, because of the deaths and the bombs and the different events that are taking place in this revolution, I also understand why some people have said that this is not appropriate reading for young children. If we're talking about a 10-year-old child, no, I wouldn't have them read this. They're not quite ready to understand the concepts that eventually take place later on in this story. If we're talking about a high schooler, absolutely have them read this and talk to them about it. The interesting thing about this story, though, for Marjane, her parents they were revolutionaries and they continue to be so, but they are very big advocates of education. So in a lot of ways, they constantly push their daughter to learn more, to experience more, and to make sure that she understands, these full concepts. So when we get further on in the stories and you see in the public schools how they start banning certain books. So when they try kind of curbing the rhetoric that's taught in the schools to make sure that everything is very positive and you're never questioning the government, Marjane is the first one that says, no, I know the truth, and she speaks with that childlike innocence that doesn't think twice when she's questioning her teacher about some of the consequences of vocally telling someone in that position of power that they are dead wrong. There's a lot of conviction to this character as she's growing, and especially as she knows better, that she can't just be fooled and told, no, just a quick little pat on the head, everything's going to be just fine. Instead, she does question, she does try and kind of push a little bit further just to make sure that she's seeing the full story and that she understands exactly what's going on. And with everything that takes place in this book, in a lot of ways that's vital, because otherwise you kind of get the wool over your eyes and you don't see what's really going on. So having that as our main character is definitely a big priority, and I'm glad they picked Margie, because like I said, you kind of step into her shoes and you also understand why she's taking her small little rebellions and why she takes the steps that she does. One of the most impactful chapters was when Margie decides to rebel. And Americans know when we say rebelling teenagers, there is an image that comes to mind that is so much riskier than what Margie does. Margie puts on her American jeans. She goes out and she's still wearing her veil, so that way she's appropriate, but below the veil, she is wearing her comfortable clothes and she's listening to rock music and she's going to the black market to get more music. And when she heads out, she knows to be weary of the men who, of course, will be enforcing these laws. And it's actually the women that are the ones that hold her and say, no, something's wrong. And they try and question her. They try to make sure that she is punished for going out in public in these clothes, for skipping school, for doing things that teenagers do. And when she goes home, her parents realize just how bad things could have been. If I look back at my own childhood, if I had cut class, I never have to worry about my government arresting me, going after my parents for civil disobedience. Instead, I'd just cut class and I'd probably just maybe get grounded. There's an absolute sense of understanding that we need to have when we look at this book, because life in Iran, especially for Margie, is so different from the childhoods that we grew up with. So I do appreciate that it's giving us a new perspective. And I've talked to you all about those stories that I feel like take you on a different journey and expose you to something that you're not familiar with. Now, I have read other books about the conflicts between Iraq and Iran, but I've mostly read them from the perspective of Iraq. So this was great to hear more about Iran. But I will say, in comparison, this story is still very simple. Even as it gets more complicated as you get further into the storyline, this is not pushing a political agenda. This is not pushing a lot of rhetoric down your throat. It's not trying to add those emotional, Hollywood moments to make you cry and scream, why? Instead, it's trying to present this gray area, because every single conflict has a gray area where it's never 100% this person's right or that one is. And that gray area is where I love to be, which, as many of you have noticed with this channel, that's what I love talking about more than anything. Because the gray area is where you get a lot of those questions and you learn the most. So that's what this book is trying to get us all to do, is to look into those gray moments and say, well, what happened in Iran? Why did it get to this point? How do we fix it? Can it be fixed? How are the lives of these children impacted from those that had to leave their country to those that stayed? How would having that as your childhood upbringing affect you? Knowing that whether you're at school, you're at a friend's house, or even you're just on your way home from school, nothing is safe. The only equivalent that we have as Americans are some of the World War II stories, movies that, of course, we watch when we're in our social studies classes. We hear about what it was like to grow up in a Hitler Germany and some of the oppressions that went on and how the children were almost weaponized against the families. The violence in this story never hits those points. There is violence, but we're not seeing Schindler's List. Instead, we're getting glimpses, but also a little bit further into the story, if we ever delved that far, we know that some of that grit would be there. Now, my thoughts on this story, when I started reading it, I did not think that this was one of the top 10 books of all times. It was good. It was very simple. It was a very quick read. Art's very simplistic. And I kept kind of flipping through wondering when I was gonna get that grit moment. And the grit is there, but is still kind of sprinkled in. So they never get to a point of really hitting you over the head with it, which I think in a lot of ways actually helps the story for other readers. For me, I like my gritty stories, but for someone else who's wanting to kind of learn a little bit more, but isn't sure how far they want to go down the rabbit hole, this actually is less abrasive and a little bit easier to follow this innocent little girl on her journey as she grows up. And it's a little bit easier to read because of that. So it's one of the reasons that this is a New York Times bestseller, is because you kind of get taken aback by this main character and by the simplicity of the story, that you don't realize that you are following a very complex conflict, which I do actually think is incredibly ingenious for the author. For me personally, if I was choosing between this book and maybe something that was a bit grittier, I'd probably pick the grittier story. But I do have to appreciate this for what it is. I definitely recommend reading it. Even if you just read it once, I found this at a used bookstore. It was brand new. You can definitely find it. Would I read this over and over again? No. But I can definitely appreciate it, and I will be looking for volume 2. The big thing for me was that this opened my eyes to a couple things that I hadn't considered. So the big thing for me, though, I will say, is even though I started this story flipping, the characters were fun, but I didn't really get deep into them, by the time the story ended, I was emotionally connected to these characters. I cared what happened to Margie. I cared what happened to her family. And there are plenty of stories that I finished and I couldn't have cared less what happened to anyone involved. So, yes, I'm constantly saying the word simple, but they still caught me in the end, which is why I still say you should give it a try. I love a story that takes me on a journey and catches me a little off guard. And I think that's exactly what this did. So my question for you all down in the comments. Now, no political banter. This is a safe channel. I will delete anything politically motivated in the comment section. Please don't do it. Let's keep this about the book, the story, and learning a different perspective. Okay? Down in the comment section, please let me know, have you ever read this book? Have you considered it? Or have any of your children had to read this in school? If you haven't read it, have you read a different book that maybe gave you a different perspective on a wartime story, whether it's in the United States, in another country, or a country that you're not as familiar with? Or let me know if you have watched the animated film. I haven't watched it yet, but I definitely wanted to start with the book. So I look forward to talking to you all again very soon, and I hope you have a wonderful day.